All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Kevin Rain, president of FAMM. Thanks for joining us for another edition of our Heart to Heart series. Before I introduce the show, I just want to mention today we have a Twitter campaign going on called #WeDemandBetter. And we're trying to call attention to the terrible prison conditions at the state and federal level and give people an opportunity to contact their lawmakers and representatives to let them know that they want change and they want their loved ones protected or sent home if they can't be protected. So if you haven't participated yet, please go to Twitter or go to FAMM's Facebook page to figure out how you can get involved. One thing we hear a lot from our families is that no one seems to be listening. That's certainly true of politicians, but we have been fortunate during this tough time to have a lot of members of the press who have been willing to share stories of families and what they're going through. And a lot of you have asked us how you can get your stories out. And so Rabiah Burks, our Vice President of Communications, had a great idea of asking some excellent reporters to take some time to share with you how they approach these issues and what kind of stories they're looking at and things like that. And so we're very grateful to them. She'll introduce them. I'm just happy to have the opportunity to introduce Rabiah to you all again, and take it over, Rabiah.
Hi, everybody. So I want to take a moment to introduce our fine panelists. We have Kristine Phillips, who covers criminal justice issues for USA Today. She formerly worked for the Washington Post. We also have Angela Ganote, who is at Fox 59 in Indianapolis, and Jamiles Lartey, who's at the Marshall Project, and he was formerly at The Guardian. So welcome. I'd like to start off by asking pretty much a softball question, which is, I would like to ask Kristine, are you able to describe your work? How did you come to cover criminal justice as an issue? Because I know you've been covering it for quite a while.
Yeah, so I actually started as a local crime reporter at the Indianapolis Star. I remember Angela from when I was in Indianapolis. So that's how I started my career. I would show up at crime scenes, and then I also covered the courts and the legal system. And now at USA Today, I'm part of a team that covers the Justice Department. We cover the special counsel Mueller investigation. And we also cover the federal criminal cases that came out of that, like Roger Stone, Michael Flynn. With COVID-19, that kind of changed a lot of what we cover. Half of our time have been devoted to looking at how the pandemic has affected policing, prison conditions, stuff like that. And I know I've worked with FAMM on some of those stories. That's kind of it in a nutshell. It's a big beat that I'm still definitely trying to learn. So yeah.
And you, Angela?
I started in the industry 27 years ago, and I started as a reporter, and I've been in Indiana most of my life. I worked for NBC in Columbus, Ohio for 3 years, but was at 2 CBS affiliates, and then NBC, and now Fox. But I started as a reporter and anchor, and I did cover crime heavily as breaking news for local news. And for the last almost 20 years, I've been a news anchor at Fox 59 Morning News. I've done the morning show where we often have breaking news. I cover that from behind the desk, but I, from there, talk with more of political leaders, police chiefs, and still cover breaking news. And then I will say, here recently is for the first time I've really been speaking about, I have a family member incarcerated, and learning things for the last 5 years has changed me forever. And now that I see, and I'm in that, it changes what I am passionate about even more. So people may see me talking about it even more on a personal side, as well as on television as well.
That's awesome. Jamiles?
Hey, yeah, I think I had a slightly more circuitous route into the industry. Out of college, I was working in the nonprofit and human services sectors, and kind of found myself often at my desk reading lots of articles and news and commentary. And I started kind of writing casually on a blog and on social media about some of these issues. And just kind of felt like I enjoyed that more than the work I was doing. I found a graduate program at NYU that would allow me to study journalism and also Africana studies, which was kind of part of my academic and intellectual background and interest. And so that's sort of how I kind of reoriented myself and wound up joining the Guardian as a fellow for this at the time secret criminal justice project. I'd done most of my journalism in grad school around the criminal justice system just because it was a passion and an interest of mine. And the project I joined them for turned out to be The Counted, which was a 2015 and 2016 journalistic investigative project in which we tried to keep track of all of the people killed by police in America. And so from there, it's just kind of been a continuation along that line.
Cool. So I want to kind of get into the story creation process. So a lot of people think that, you know, you just call a reporter and then they either write or produce the story, and it should be just that easy. And they don't know what all goes into it. They don't know anything about an editor. They don't know anything about just the sure death or producers and everyone who is involved in that process. I kind of want to talk to you each about how it works at your individual paper, either paper or television stations. And I want to start with Kristine at USA Today. How does it work, and how does it work for you generally?
Yeah, so one thing I've learned from moving from being a local crime reporter to being a national criminal justice reporter is that, you know, your beat is essentially the whole country, and your audience is not just a small community. So the bar is always higher on what kinds of stories we pursue. Usually it has to be, you know, tied to a national trend, or it has to touch on the national issue of the moment. Like right now it's policing and George Floyd. And, you know, it can, when in instances that, you know, a story idea doesn't meet those two criteria, you know, something has to be, there has to be a really powerful human element. One thing I learned from covering criminal justice is that it's hard to make, you know, the country sympathize with someone unless you can make them human, make them seem a lot more, you know, really compelling. And if they have, you know, a really compelling story to share, that's one thing. And the other criteria that we always look for is there, you know, an egregious government misconduct that's representative of what's happening in other countries. It's hard to, you know, oftentimes I receive news tips from, you know, people from, you know, Indiana, for example, or a random city or town, and they want us to, hey, write this story about what happened to me and what happened to my friend. You know, a lot of times it's just not something that my editor would allow me to do just because it's so localized. And, you know, as is true with every news outlets, USA Today is, you know, a lot of reporters at my newspaper are all stretched pretty thinly, and there's so many things that we could always jump on. There's so many things that we should jump on, but we still have to be really selective. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that we look for. There has to be a really powerful human element to it, something that speaks to a national issue or a national trend.
And you, Angela, how's it different at your paper? I keep calling it a paper.
That's okay. And if you do, it's okay. I think a couple things hit home for me that when she was talking about how stretched thin, we might not be stretched thin as in TV, but that is really across the board with journalists, you know, trying to cover news or what is happening. In TV, it's different because you have so many hours of television a day. And where I strongly push back against the idea that we just fill news or space or time, we don't, but you have to be able to do it quickly. And that's what makes it different. Where I am going to be on television, I know from 7 to 10 every morning, and I have to have my stuff ready and it has to go. The news is always on at 5 or 6 p.m. at night. So if we have a reporter that's, going to be live, we have to decide at 9 a.m. that morning, what is the story of the day going to be? And then unless there's breaking news, that's what you're going to cover. We do investigative things. I have been blessed with being able to do that, but it takes a lot of time. And when you're talking about criminal justice topics, a lot of time, where Kristine was talking about that, we had a case recently where there was something that I would felt pretty passionate about. And someone in our newsroom said, but our viewers don't sympathize with them. That won't be a good story, or that is not something necessarily we should put on television. And I disagree with that, but that is what is happening in our newsrooms, where we are having this discussion of maybe 10, 12, 15 people in a morning meeting that are discussing what is that topic of the day. What are you going to put on the news that night? Who are you going to interview? And if someone doesn't believe someone will make a good story, or someone will not sympathize with them or want to watch that, we won't cover that.
Jamiles?
I'll say I come from, I guess, maybe probably as opposite a news speed as there can be from TV, right? So at the Marshall Project, our kind of mandate is to do things that are big and step back and take in the system as a whole. And it's not unusual. Well, things have changed in this kind of current moment between coronavirus and then the policing protests, but kind of before that, in February of 2020 and before, it wouldn't be unusual for a Marshall Project reporter to only publish 3 to 6 stories in the course of a year, right? So that's a much different gear to be in, and it just means that we look at what makes a story in kind of a different through a different lens than the daily newspaper, which is a lot of the stuff I was doing at the Guardian before I came to the Marshall Project, or a television station. And so for us, much like what Kristine was saying, it is about having national resonance. It's very difficult for us to get a concept past editors that feels hyper local, that feels very particular to a place. But what I'll also say is that, and one of the luxuries that I have of being at a place where there isn't this kind of churn need to be constantly producing content, is that we have time to actually have those conversations, even if they're not necessarily going to lead to a story that we're going to publish today or this week or this month, right? So like one of the most important ways as reporters that we can understand what a national trend is, and discover new national trends and not just hop on a train that's already been discovered that people are already talking about, is to take those phone calls from people who say, hey, this thing happened to me. Maybe you get 4 of those phone calls in the course of a year, or 6, or in the course of 3 years, you get 10 or 15, and you start, piecing together, oh, wow, this is a phenomenon that a lot of people are dealing with. And maybe we can draw up like a geographic map of where this is happening, or a map of like, oh, it's in states where their legal system is set up like this. People are dealing with this, and it enables us to tell some of these deeper stories and stories that kind of introduce new information to the public. And to your broader question, Rabiah, about kind of what makes a story, I think this is one of the most subjective, loaded standards in media, and one that we as an industry need to do a better job of challenging and revisiting some of our old assumptions. The old standard is honestly a lot like the standard for what makes a decent movie or novel, right? So like if there's a novelty, right? The old news saying is, dog bites man, that's not a story. Man bites dog, that's a story. It's novel, it's weird, it catches people's attention. Drama, conflict, so if we think specifically about criminal justice, I mean, you also have the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Violence also catches people's attention. But in the case of criminal justice, think about a new reform, right? The bail reform, for example, is something I've written about. There are strong incentives for us as an industry to cover the one person who gets out of jail under a bail reform package and do a big splashy story about that, versus the 99 people who do not. One of those makes a much better news story under our current kind of framework than the other. That has to do with kind of internally in newsrooms, what we're thinking about as news, but also externally as a public, as a society, of what we pay attention to and what we just sort of gloss over.
Do you find that COVID-19 has changed your reporting at all? And anyone could jump in on this question. It's just, has it changed your reporting, how people send you pitches? And I know that the news of the day can change, but how has it impacted your coverage?
I'll jump in first. So I think, as I hinted on this earlier, I don't even remember what I was covering back in February. March, April, May, most of the stories that I've done outside of the regular DOJ stories that is part of the job, like, you know, anything related to Mueller or Roger Stone or Michael Flynn, it has been tied to COVID-19 and the criminal justice system. You know, we did a story about how the pandemic affects rural police. We did a story about early on about how, you know, when the courts started to close down, we did a story about, you know, how the pandemic is upending the criminal justice system. I did a story about the impact on juvenile detainees. And there's also one other story that I did, you know, after Paul Manafort got out of prison or was moved to home confinement because he's elderly and he's sick, and there's, you know, obviously the COVID fears. I wrote a story about how, okay, well, sure, he's elderly and he's sick, but the federal system has thousands of other elderly inmates who are also nonviolent, who aren't being released. So the way we think about stories, at least in the past a couple of months, we always try, at least for me, I always try to find the coronavirus angle to it. You know, I've been in communications with a bunch of federal prisoners at Fort Worth and a couple of other federal prisons. And that's like a story that is still in the works. So yeah, it pretty much almost entirely redefined my beat, at least at the moment. I had other, you know, story ideas I wanted to do back in February that I probably will never be able to do. So yeah, it's hard to recognize what January or February looks like in terms of beat coverage. And it's hard to predict what, you know, the next few months would look like in terms of criminal justice and coronavirus coverage. Courts are opening back up. The federal prison system still has a lot of coronavirus cases. So yeah, any enterprise stories that I'm doing are basically tied to coronavirus.
For me, at Fox 59 in Indianapolis, first of all, not just every story, you know, since, as you were saying, Kristine, since, you know, February, there hasn't been a news block probably that hasn't had some kind of coronavirus story within that news block, because everything is affected by it. Even, you know, now as kids are trying to go back to school, everything is hyper local on what all of different schools are planning and how they're doing that, if they're going to have kids back at school. But all of the story part of it aside, and our discussions about that is just our workplace and how you bring in guests, how you're interviewing people, the building change, you know, producers and writers, people were taking their computers home. We stayed in our building, at least on the show that I do. I anchored from the news desk through this, but a lot of people were anchoring from their homes and taking computers, setting up studios in their houses, from producers to directors, you know, all across the board. You know, the newsroom looks different now, how we meet, how we talk, how we gather. There's plastic barriers up in the newsroom. We're wearing masks at times. You know, we're at the anchor desk, part of our morning show. We are like a family, and we like to joke and goof around. And it's, you know, I'm sitting at the desk. You know, my coworker Ray is sitting 15 feet away at a couch. Our meteorologist is another 15 feet away in the weather center. And that changes the dynamic too, and how you interact with one another. Everything's is like this, you know, in a 4-box. Where you're doing your job completely different. But I think that as far as journalists go and the news media, writers, everybody across the board, we've really stepped it up in a crazy way to make adjustments, to make sure that we can still cover news and make sure that people are getting the information that they need and asking tough questions, whether it be at a news conference that is now virtually, where we're still asking our governor and our mayor to answer those tough questions on what is happening within our city and beyond.
Yeah, and you know, in our newsroom, I mean, obviously there's kind of like the physical element where everyone is now at home, and you know that changes the dynamic of work. I mean, one of the things that was kind of one of the moments that I remember kind of all of this becoming really real to me was I had a bunch of interviews and travel scheduled, and we had to kind of sit down and reckon with the fact of not just, you know, might this be risky as an employee, as a journalist, right? I'm going out into the world and maybe I'll contract coronavirus. I think a lot of journalists are used to a certain amount of calculated risk in our work, right? The world is a dangerous place. We report on the world. So sometimes that's part of the work, but also recognizing this new dynamic that, you know, if I am out reporting a story that doesn't need to be reported right now in this moment, I could potentially be the disease vector by walking into someone's home, asking them to tell their story to me. I may be the reason why they contract the disease, the reason why someone in their family, maybe a person with a pre-existing illness or, you know, other vulnerabilities contracts the disease. So it changed a little bit the whole calculation around, you know, what merits in-person storytelling. How do we make these travel decisions? How do we make these? I mean, it's a moral dimension to reporting that I think I don't recall a time that we've had to kind of think about before, and it's definitely changed the way that I and we approach stories. I mean, I think you know, TV people in a lot of ways need to get out in person, and while there's been a lot of, you know, creative problem solving in terms of getting people on Zoom or Skype or you know, what have you, I think that's been a bigger challenge for them than for us as writers. We're used to talking to people on the phone. But you know, all of the best interviews as a writer that you'll ever do are in person, because there's all of these little nuances and details, and just a comfort, right? When you can establish a human rapport with someone and they're not just a sound on the other side of a handset, but you know, you're in a room and you're able to maybe, you know, share a drink or food or read each other's body language. So that is something that I miss and feels different. And I am kind of anxious for the day when we'll have that back. But, you know, for now, it's still important to tell these stories. So we have to find ways to do it and do it safely.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% on board. I think, so one of the questions I really wanted to get to was, and I think you guys touched on it briefly, but I wanted to kind of go more in depth about it. A lot of people who are directly touched by the criminal justice system do want to hear their stories told, and they often feel like they are not being told, or they feel like other things are being prioritized. Can you touch a little bit on what makes something newsworthy? What is that wow factor? What are some of the things that the standards that you would have to jump through in order to get it to any of you guys' hands and out into a publication or on air? Anybody can jump in on that one.
I'll start this time, because I think this is probably, I get so many requests every day, dozens and dozens of people that want their story told. And without evidence, without hardcore receipts, we cannot tell the story. And I think sometimes people think, oh, the news media just puts whatever out there, or you know, somebody in the newspaper, they can just write whatever and it doesn't have to be true. Well, we actually fact check very, very hard. And for one example, I had, you know, and out of all the stories that are brought to you, like, let's just say in the last 5 years, so many that I believed in my heart and I wanted to tell them, but I didn't have the evidence to be able to put it on television. And out of fear of, what if I was wrong? If there was any part of that wasn't wrong, you would be sued. You could probably, you know, you may defame someone. I had a young lady that sent me an email. It started with actually a Facebook message, and it said, Angela, and I'll kind of summarize it. Basically, I believe that my mother's OBGYN is my father, and I believe that he may have used his sperm on multiple women. And I was like, okay, that sounds like that's wow. Okay, bring me the evidence. And she brought the facts. She brought the receipts. And from that, it took me more than a year to be able to put it together, but we were able to start unraveling that story with her being able to have the evidence, to have the courage to trust me, to share, and then to be able to uncover that he, in fact, fathered more than 60 children after when it was all said and done.
Wow. Wow.
Good.
Go ahead.
Well, just adding to what Angela said, you know, a lot of times, like she said, we get a lot of news tips from people who say, oh, this happened to me, or my ex-husband did this or that. But, you know, anytime I follow up and, hey, do you have any documents, or do you have, you know, things I could use to back it up, or other people I could talk to, that often sometimes ends the conversation. So I think, like you said, Rabiah, one misconception about reporters is that they just put out, you know, whatever out there. But in every newsroom that I've been a part of, and I can, you know, with every reporter that I've worked with and interacted with, we really go through a lot of work to verify what we report. One time when I was 7-8 years ago, I was a younger news reporter. I misquoted someone and I was called into the office. I thought I was going to be fired. So that just gives you an idea of, you know, how much trouble we could get if we put something out there that's false. So anytime we get a news tip, it takes a lot of, you know, work to get that verified. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, from a national outlet standpoint, there's a higher bar on what kinds of stories we jump on. There's, you know, I have done stories that don't necessarily speak to a national trend or a national issue, but the human element and just the egregiousness of the misconduct that was alleged there was just so bad, and it was backed up by documents that, yes, absolutely, we should do that story. So yeah, I think that, yeah, that's it.
All I'll add, I absolutely think that's a lot of great points made. All I'll add is that, you know, we need people to tell us what's going on, right? So I guess if you could walk away from this talk with kind of any piece of knowledge, it's like, we want to hear from you, and we want to hear your stories. And just because it doesn't wind up on the evening news, just because it doesn't wind up in an explosive article, doesn't mean that we didn't appreciate it, doesn't mean that it wasn't useful, and doesn't mean that it won't shape the way that we approach covering that topic in the future, right? Every time that a person who has been impacted, let's keep it to criminal justice because that's what we're talking about. A person who's been impacted by the criminal justice system reaches out to a reporter and tells them their story, you are contributing to the overall knowledge base of that reporter about the universe of possibilities of things that can happen in the system. So, you know, I 1000% understand that if the remedy that you seek is public attention to a thing, and you reach out and you offer your story, and it's not, you know, crafted into a way that the public gets it and it has an impact, I can totally understand how that would be disappointing or dispiriting. But I guess all I want to express is that it's still valuable. All of these stories are valuable. Everything that you tell a reporter is valuable. And, you know, if you want to email me anything, please do. I'm like always thrilled to get, and I think that's true of most reporters. I think most reporters will write you back. Like, don't feel like reporters are special or are like celebrities who don't like this is not fan mail. This is not like, hey, you're so great. Like where, you know, I don't know, Kanye West or Kim Kardashian just read it and there's, you know, okay, whatever. There's a million of these. Like each individual story that someone brings to us as a reporter, like adds value. So like, don't hesitate or be shy about it.
So, I mean, so all of this goes into another, for our families, a lot of them have loved ones who are in prison. And we know that covering prisons is particularly challenging. And so a lot of them are very much concerned about COVID-19 basically ravaging prisons and not enough attention being kind of shown to the issues there. Can you talk a little bit about what would be some of the challenges in covering the prisons in general? And then also like, as it pertains to COVID-19, why don't we see like just a plethora of stories over and over again? Or if you feel like there are a lot of stories coming out based on your knowledge of the news, let's go at it. So whoever wants to take it first.
So my experience have been mostly with the Bureau of Prisons. I think one challenge with writing about coronavirus that affects the federal prison system is that the Bureau of Prisons is really good at not saying anything. One time I did a story about coronavirus and elderly prisoners. I sent a list of 10, maybe 15 questions. And the spokesman sent me, a few days later, this 5-page long response that is a lot of words, but didn't really answer any of my questions. It's a lot of like bureaucratic talk. That's one roadblock that, that we encounter when covering anything that's in the federal system. The other thing is, anytime that I talk to a prisoner in the federal, in really state or federal prison system, I will not be able to get that story published unless whatever that prisoner tells me is backed up by several other sources. So I talk to multiple prisoners. I talk to, as many as I could in the time that I have. And, if you're dealing with a federal prison system, you're only allowed 15-minute phone calls at a time. So it takes a while. So that has been the main challenge. So, if people don't notice that many stories about coronavirus in prisons, it's just that, penetrating that system is hard. And you do that while also juggling several other responsibilities. If you're in a daily newspaper, you have the daily demand and the unrelenting deadlines. Oftentimes I'm working on my enterprise prison stories on weekends when I have time. So it's just that the reality of covering that topic, it's just inherently difficult, especially in this day and age.
Very, very hard. I think there's also this perception that prisoners deserve it. You know how many times that I've had someone say to me, especially if I'm on Twitter talking about something, and they're like, oh, well, they shouldn't have committed a crime. Well, they shouldn't be in there in the first place. And I got into it a little bit with somebody on Twitter today talking about that very thing. But then I kind of turned it around the other way. And I said, well, I'm actually working on a case right now where there's an individual who, in court documents, the 3 people that witnessed this particular murder, all 3, including the victim's brother, believe it was self-defense. Are you telling me that you think that someone that I know what you're talking about right now, you're saying that he should not be able to have a bail hearing? You believe on day 50, it's okay for him to be sitting in there with no hearing, not to be able to go before a judge when someone or multiple people that saw it think it was self-defense, and you were okay with that. And you're going to come back right now and get mad at me because I am, tweeting about criminal justice. And he's like, oh, no, that's not what I was talking about. I'm like, well, that's what you just got really mad about because you thought that I was, promoting letting everybody out of prison. And that's not often what, people are even discussing. If a reporter wants to even talk about the issue, sometimes then it comes back on us that we are taking a side. And I think that we're just in this political environment right now where sometimes people try to look for where does she stand? Where does he stand? What is her motive? What is his motive? When I try to tell people my motive is facts, my motive is truth, my motive is seeking justice for all.
And yeah, what I would add to the question about, what is available in the media, I mean, I haven't looked at this empirically, so don't quote me on this, but I would guess that since March, there have been more articles in the media about the dangers of being in prison or jail published than in the previous 10 years.
Yeah,
I would guess that that is probably true. And if you want like a resource for reading some of that you can check out the Marshall Project. We have a thing called The Record, where all of our everyone who works for us basically can tag articles and other news pieces that they see with topics. And I think our coronavirus and COVID tag has over 3,000 articles now. And most of those are about the challenges that people are facing and the risks that people are facing in jails and prisons. So is that enough? I mean, I don't know I don't think there's like an objective answer to how many stories is enough. I think there's always some terrible circumstance that we in the media are missing, right? Just by definition, we're going to miss some of it. But I would say there's a lot that's been written on this topic, and that's in part because a lot of people are interested in this topic in a way that they haven't been before. And so I think in the media, I always think it's incumbent upon us, rather than sort of judging people for not having paid attention to all things at all times since the dawn of time, to use the fact that people are interested in an issue, that something's caught their attention, to use that as an opportunity, as a way in to then broaden out and talk about some of the more distant aspects of it, aspects of how this system works, right? Coronavirus makes prisons more dangerous, but here are all the ways that prisons were already dangerous or will continue to be dangerous after coronavirus. That's a conversation that people will pay more attention to in this moment versus 6 months ago.
It'd be interesting to see how many local TV stations have covered prisons at all, or COVID in prisons at all, right? How many local TV, news programs have you seen where you turned on the television and they were talking about COVID in a prison? I think that would be an interesting, does that happen very often?
My guess, my very biased guess is that it's happened a lot less on TV than it has in local newspapers. But.
Yes. And I think more than anyone, the Marshall Project actually has done a really good job of covering prisons and coronavirus, really more than any of the major media outlets that I know of. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
I agree.
Angela, can you talk a little bit what are some of the challenges of covering prisons on television? That's, I think, is very, because I think Jamiles is right. Like, there has been written pieces, but as far as getting it on television, I've seen stories, but just not in the same abundance.
There's so many, maybe, the top 5, I could run them down, but I think part of it is, Kristine talked about the Bureau of Prisons. It's so hard to get anything factual, right down with lockdowns. People aren't on the phone. They're not, they might have 5 minutes to call their family member. Are they going to talk to a reporter for, 2 minutes to be able to try to tell that story when they know that it's being recorded, and then they're going to face retaliation for speaking? That's not going to happen. There's a lot of people that know that, there are sometimes videos that come out of prison, but if you're going to say that this is happening inside your local prison, how are you going to even get proof to me that that's happening? That is extremely hard. So, my news director is going to say, well, that sounds like a great story. If it's true, how do you prove it? And they're like, what normally you're going to hear is, well, that person has a reason to be lying to you. They're in prison. They're a criminal. Why would you believe their story? So you have to overcome all of these obstacles to be able to even get that story on television to begin with. And it's, I would say, nearly impossible in many cases.
So I want to pivot a little bit to anonymous sources. A lot of our families, I hear it time and time again. Well, I have this great story. I want to tell my story, but I am afraid of retribution for my loved one who is incarcerated. I will talk to the reporter, but I want to be anonymous. at the same time, they want the story to be the biggest story to come out of, So like, how do you guys deal with anonymous sources? I mean, do you use them, and in what cases do you use them? And yeah, so whoever wants to.
I can speak to, I think our policy, and I think most newsrooms, it's fair. Most newsrooms may have kind of a set of general regulations on this, but it's usually kind of case by case basis. And, in my experience, obviously editors always prefer that you name your sources. It takes a lot of the, a lot of variables out of kind of, I mean, just quite literally, it's a more accurate news story if you're saying this happened to the person it happened to, rather than a fake name or no name. So, editors tend to be skeptical and prefer that you get people to go on the record. But, I think increasingly, I hope increasingly, there is a reckoning and a recognition that we don't own people's stories. They are not ours. We are not entitled to them, right? People are sharing with us. They are taking great personal risk in many cases to tell us what happened to them. And, when we move on to tell another story, they're still left with the ramifications of that. So, I think that there is, in one part, kind of a human understanding that, we should be empathetic and sympathetic and appreciative of the fact that people are approaching us and willing to share with us at all. And be a recognition that, if a story is important, and if you can sort of explain, if you can explain to a reasonable reader why the story you're telling demands anonymity, then you can tell it. But it does raise the bar for some of the fact checking, for some of the kind of, I guess, interestingness that you have to overcome to get it approved for for fact checking purposes and beyond editors in terms of like, will people read this? Will people be interested in it? Right. I mean, but you just think about it. Would you, like, if you're reading, okay, there's like a somewhat interesting phenomenon, somewhat interesting thing that's happening in society, and you have two versions of it. In one, you don't see a face, you don't get a name, you don't get any details, you don't know where they live. And in the other one, you've got this powerful profile, and you're sympathizing and you're empathizing, and you're like, I can see what this person's going through. I mean, one of those is going to connect much more powerfully with people. Like that's just the reality of storytelling.
I was going to say that too, because it's about making those connections, right? And if you can't make that connection on a human level of really caring about what you're writing about, or having someone else who's going to read and say, oh my gosh, I'm touched by that. I understand. I can feel that. I now understand maybe a little bit more what that person's going through, or why I should pay more attention, or why I should care. Without that, it's probably not going to make it, in the newspaper or on television without that, when there are so many other options out there. I mean, just even like meeting you guys, I'm going to want to now, because I've made this human connection with you, I'm going to want to go read your articles, the ones that you're writing, even now more, because I'm like, I saw them and now I want to read more. That's just human nature. That's who we are.
And so one thing I've done in the past when I encounter people or sources who are very anxious about, talking to reporters, or are very in fear of retaliation if they talk to me, is, I would agree to talk to them completely off the record, just to, just tell me everything off the record. And that's the main purpose, is to just get a conversation started, to get a rapport started. And then as we go along, as that person goes along and telling his or her story, it could lead me to another person who might be willing to talk. It could lead me to more documents that could back up what they're saying. So, in some cases, we have granted anonymity to sources if what they're saying is backed by documents. Two, if what they're saying is backed by other sources, even if they're also anonymous. So for example, we did a story a few months ago about this persisting violence in Alabama state men's prisons. The Justice Department did this big investigation about civil rights violations, sexual abuse, this underground drug trade that's happening in the men's prisons. And a year after that investigation, nothing has happened. It's still violent. That in 2019, the state prison system in Alabama saw its most violent year in decades. I think it was 16 prisoners who were murdered that year. And so for that story, we talked to a lot of prisoners. Most of them did not want to be named because of fear of retaliation. So, in that case, we granted anonymity just because we were talking to several of them who are saying the same thing that's backed up by the same, the Justice Department's own investigation also reflects. So yeah, it's I think it was Angela or Jamiles who said that it's a case-by-case basis where we decide when to grant anonymity.
So now talking about sources, I want to pivot to sources. You're writing a story, you can call anybody. How do you choose? How do you decide who you're going to call? How do you choose what would make the story good? And do you quote everyone you talk to? I mean, or do you have everyone appear that you talk to? So what is your process in choosing sources? Why do you choose them? What's that like for you?
I'll start here because I live in Indiana, right? And I'm going to be 50 this year. I'm just going to say it. And so I've lived in Indiana for 47 of those 50 years. So my sources are people that I've known for a long time and people that I trust because I'm in that same community. So maybe I have someone that I know I feel very, very confident that they are going and they trust me. Where if I say, hey, here's what I'm hearing, can you at least tell me if I'm on the right path? Or, and I'm going to know and I'm going to trust that source because we have this really tight relationship. I'm working on a couple cases right now where they trust me so much. I have information that it's kind of a big story. It's actually a very big story. And, but this person knows that they can trust me with that. So I'm able to do all kinds of work behind the scenes and I'm going to have it ready so that when it can be, ready for release, I'm going to be ready for that. I will say this about sources. If you talk to me off the record, I feel, and I know you two feel so strong about this, I will go to jail before I would release my source's name. You tell me something off the record, something that you can't come to me and you know that it's true and you feel very strong about it and you could be retaliated against. There's nothing in this world that is going to make me speak and to destroy your life over protecting myself after you share something, if that makes sense. I think that as journalists, we take that very, very seriously. And I just hope that more people would want to talk to us and share their stories and know that how serious we take our sources. Because if people aren't talking to us and sharing information about what is happening that is wrong in our world, we can't help anyone. And that's really what I do continually now after 27 years, because I want to help people.
Yeah. I think it depends on the story, how you're going to approach cultivating sources. I think local news is much more built on these kind of long-term symbiotic relationships. Yeah. In the national news, we find ourselves kind of much more running around like a chicken with its head cut off. Like, imagine trying to pitch. I'm just trying to think of like trying to pitch my editors a story like a wonky, nerdy story about police reform 2 months ago. They would have looked at me like I was crazy, right? And now, if I bring them a wonky, nerdy story about policing reform, they're like, yes, please, 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 please go write that right now. So I say all that to say that we're kind of often hopping around from thing to thing. And Matt Taibbi recently described our profession as professional test crammers. That our job is basically to learn all of the facts about a thing like really, really fast and be able to regurgitate it in a way that we can make sense of it for people who don't have the time to learn about it really, really fast and need to learn about it really, 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 really fast. Yeah. I say that to say a lot of my stories will take like one of two directions. Either I'm finding out about an idea from an affected person and I need to find other affected people and then also some experts who can speak to it. or vice versa. I'm finding out about a phenomenon because some expert has published a study or thinks that I should look at something, and then I'm then trying to find people who it has affected directly. So it kind of depends on how the germ of the story comes to me. But most print stories that you do will kind of have those two elements going back and forth. It's like a person who's dealt with this directly, and some people who've studied about it or know about it in an official sense who can kind of add context to it.
So a couple of golden rules that I try to live by when I have the time and the luxury of the time is to over-report on things. I talk to more people than I need, especially on topics that I am just learning myself. Before I even start writing, I would talk to as many experts as I could. Even if I don't end up quoting them in the story, I usually tell people, hey, just educate me. I'm not quoting you, just tell me what this means. That's usually a lot of my conversations with former federal prosecutors that I talk to is, so is this a big deal, or what does this legal term mean? And like what Jamiles said, oftentimes when we do a story, one thing that's been real to me personally when I was in journalism school is get both sides of the story. So looking back now, I would kind of disagree with that, because it's not just both sides, it's all sides. You talk to as many people as possible, not just the two opposing sides, but you talk to experts in between who have a point of view one way or another. And oftentimes I would have 50 pages of transcribed interviews, and I would have to reduce it down to like a 1,000-word story that quotes only a little bit of everyone I talk to. And I think that's a good thing, because every time I talk to a source, even if I don't end up quoting them in the story, it's knowledge that I could use. It's something that I learned that I could take away from. So that's just.
So we do have a couple of questions from people who are watching. Do you feel the George Floyd story adds even more urgency to criminal justice reform issues at this moment in our history? We did have COVID. I mean, we still have COVID. We're pretending like we don't have COVID, but but now, do you guys feel like George Floyd's murder had any impact on how you tell stories now and the future of criminal justice stories to come out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that question was asked, because I think one thing that reporters, local or national, are starting to grappling with is that, for a long time, criminal justice reporters have had this one source that they've always relied on, and that's the police. When I was starting out as a local crime reporter in Indianapolis, I spent a lot of time writing, short stories that are solely based on the account of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. And then we leave it at that. We publish it and then we move on. So I think one thing that we've learned from George Floyd is that police accounts of what happened are either incomplete or outright false. For example, the Minneapolis police's account of what happened with George Floyd, the initial statement that they had just said that he was under emotional distress, completely ignored the 8 minutes or 9 minutes that the police officer was kneeling on Floyd's neck. It was not part of it. And I think what reporters, criminal justice reporters, can and should take away from what happened with George Floyd is that we should be skeptical with everyone we talk to, especially and including people with authority, people with power. Like, we should, ask the critical questions, and we should, I wish I know all of this when I was starting out as a local cops reporter, because I don't know if this is the same thing that you guys have experienced, but the cops beat is usually the job given to a newly graduated reporter, like a fresh out of college. And when you're young, you don't necessarily know to ask the probing, skeptical questions. I wish I had all that when I was starting out and writing all these cop briefs every day, 7 times a day. But the thing is, every time we write a story about someone's arrest, every time we publish a mugshot of someone, that person's life is affected indefinitely. Even when charges are eventually dismissed, I don't know what it's like to see my mugshot immortalized on TV or a newspaper, even after the charges are dropped. So I think it's a conversation that all newsrooms should have, is that it's incumbent upon reporters and editors to reevaluate how we cover crime on a daily basis, because it's something, if it's like I said, if there's one thing that we learned from George Floyd, it's that the initial police account is not necessarily always true.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that I don't know that it is George Floyd's death in custody specifically that changes things. And I say that as someone who worked on a project that kept track of hundreds, thousands of people killed by the police. People have died under the circumstances that George Floyd died under before, and they will again. And so what is hopefully generative of change, and what changes the moment, is our national attention and focus on it. The fact that people are paying attention to this question in a way that they weren't even in the Ferguson moment, and in the Freddie Gray moment, and in the Philando Castile moment, all of these kind of discrete moments where all of a sudden the national attention shifts to policing and race and justice. This one feels different in a way that a lot of folks in media, but generally in society, I think are willing to examine their complicity, their maybe lack of knowledge or understanding, and try to change that. So yeah, I mean, things as simple as adopting police jargon, right? The term officer involved shooting. Why did we start using that in the press? Newspaper editors hate what we call the passive voice, right? Describing something as like it happened rather than X person did Y. It's one of the few cardinal rules of news writing. Like, it's the first thing editors learn to call you out for as a journalist. Don't use the passive voice. Yet this term officer involved shooting has become adopted whole cloth without ever really being put to scrutiny. And I'm not even, I mean, some people are much more hardline on this question than I am. There are probably breaking news situations where all you know is the police were somewhere and then someone was shot. And officer involved shooting probably is a useful term in that situation. You don't have all the details yet. But when we know what happened and we're still using this passive term to describe, there's no defense for that. It's not useful. It provides we're doing a disservice to readers. Mugshot galleries, as Kristine brought up, I mean, are another example of the kind of can we, yes, but should we question that newsrooms have been slow historically to ask and answer, and are increasingly in this moment finally addressing. So yeah, I think there's a unique opportunity right now to kind of revisit some of the things that we've treated as normal in this industry and as a society in general, and say, wait, maybe this isn't normal. Maybe this isn't effective. Maybe this isn't useful. And maybe there are more empathetic and human-centered ways to do what we've done.
And I'll just add to, Kristine, you made that comment about, being young a lot of times when someone's just covering maybe that crime beat, or being kind of the new kid on the block, maybe that's talking with police. And I think it does come from being someone that is confident enough in themselves to be able to challenge, not just to challenge authority, but to be able to ask the tough questions and not to be afraid, to know that it's okay to stand up and to say, you know what, I'm not quite sure I believe that. I'm going to listen to what you're saying, but I'm going to make sure that I fight and go dig for the other side of that. Because I think a lot of times that, at least when I was young, you were believed, you were taught, at least I was, people don't challenge authority, to some extent. I mean, that was a long time ago. And so you kind of just believe, and that has changed a lot. And I think too, how much has social media changed things, or technology changed things? Well, now where you have a video where you can see what happens, and someone is willing to either video it and then has the courage to share it with someone to be able to say, look what really happened here. This doesn't look like what that police report looked like.
Okay. Great. I enjoyed all of you guys. I want to give you guys an opportunity to close us out with some last words or some things that you wish that we would have talked about but we didn't, or any thoughts that you have to close us out. I'll start with Angela.
I'll just end by saying thank you so much. I apologize. I'm in a vehicle. My son was just up to bat, so I'm at a baseball game. I had the day off to travel to do that, but it's very important for me. My life was changed personally 5 years ago when a family member had 17 FBI agents raid his home. Everything about my life is different today because of that. And I take it very seriously. And I'm just now at a place where I feel comfortable starting to just barely share truth where that happened. It's an interesting place to be as someone in the media and then someone who lives it daily. I try to hold myself to a standard where I'm still being a very high person of character that tries to understand everybody's side. And Kristine, you made a comment about, trying to hear everybody's side of the story. I believe that there are not only 3 sides to every story: my side, your side, maybe the one in the middle that's more kind of accurate to where the truth is, but there are sometimes 20 different perspectives within that one story and how people see that. And my truth, because it is true to me, could also be the exact opposite of what your truth is. And if we all learn to listen a little bit better and to try to understand one another, I think that we're going to be a lot better off.
Kristine?
Yeah, so just wanted to piggyback on what you guys said earlier is that, I think Jamiles said it, is that we want to hear from people. If we can't do our jobs if we just listen to press conferences and read press releases. There's no other way for the best way for us to get the best stories is really through what people in the community would tell us. So I guess it's just, I want to let the public know, I want to let people know that reporters are accessible. My email is always tied to my byline. If you look at my stories, my Twitter account, it has my email. So, just feel free to always reach out. And the other thing I want to say is that I think, like I said earlier, one misconception that people have had with reporters is that we publish anything. And I just wanted to, stress out that, it's a lot of the reporters that I've worked with and I personally, we always take the time to verify what we verify every time we report on something. And just because we don't, write a story in your point of view, our goal is always to get to the closest version of the truth as possible, to, talk to as many people and, get to the closest version of truth as possible. So.
Jamiles?
Kristine took my point.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just, I would just double down on that. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories. And I guess I would say, if you think the media does a good job covering these issues, find the reporters who you think are doing a good job and reach out to them directly. I'm sure they want to hear from you. If you think the media is missing something, if you think the media is has some bias or some inability to see the whole truth, the only way that we can see it is if you tell us. I'm not saying there aren't bad reporters. I'm not saying there aren't folks in this industry who act in bad faith. But please try. If you think the coverage in a particular subject area or in a particular geographic location is bad, please try to find the people there who are doing it best and tell them what you know and what you see. It sounds like sappy or whatever, but I think that will make it better and we'll all be better informed.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.